Well, hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. And for tonight, we have this very special and different kind of episode. And for this topic, I'm very thankful that I found two guests who are available to talk with us tonight and share with something from their extensive research. I welcome back Zechariah, who was with us for a few times, and I welcome Jordan for the first time. Welcome, guys. How is everything with you?
It's great. It's wonderful.
Good. Looking forward to the video.
Yeah, thank you again for finding time for us. Um, Zechariah, can you please remind us of who you are? What is your spiritual and theological background? Maybe what church you go to? Maybe something about the blog and the podcast that you're leading.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I'm Zechariah, and uh, generally between evangelical and kind of liturgical leaning Christian. I Off and on I host the Neurologians podcast, where we discuss fiction, science fiction, fantasy, video games, and more, and look for their theological and philosophical backgrounds and discuss those.
My name is Jordan. I am a practicing Jew. I am a philosopher by training, specializing in religious phenomenology and epistemology with an eye to encounters with the supernatural and how we interpret them as religious individuals, specifically with an eye to maybe, I don't want to say interreligious dialogue because that has certain connotations, but relations between both how we grow as religious individuals and how we speak to other religions. This is my first time showing up on a YouTube show podcast, so I'll thank you all to be patient with me if I seem a little out there. This is no real experience here.
Yeah, thank you. And just for the audience, I want to say that Jordan is the first non-Christian person on the podcast. Now that I didn't try inviting other people, but they were like either busy or maybe not responding. So I'm thankful that in this way we're just breaking another ice and getting more experience by having someone like Jordan on the podcast. And I'm, very thankful for you, Jordan. So tonight's topic, we'll be talking about cryptids. Jordan, can you please start by introducing us what are actually cryptids? What do we mean by this term?
Yeah, so cryptid is from a word meaning hidden. It's best known in connection to the word cryptozoology, hidden animal study, or basically, which is a branch of, I'm not going to say science because that's going to arouse someone's anger, but it's a branch of something, of some sort that studies animals which are hidden, not in the sense that they're like hiding under the cover of darkness, cackling or whatever, but in the sense that they are not known to the scientific community in specific. The most famous such cryptids, of course, are going to be Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Ogopogos, creatures like that, but cryptozoologists will also study all sorts of other creatures, such as the onza, a putative type of small leopard native to southern North America, or the giant jumping worm of Switzerland, or the giant bat of the Congo. More to the point, I guess, some of these animals have characteristics that are clearly immaterial or metaphysical. So, for example, in his book, The Beasts That Hide from Man, the cryptozoologist Karl Etienne Schuker describes an encounter between several members of the US Army when in Vietnam and a flying woman with bat wings. Granted that encounter involved something real, there's absolutely no reason to think that's a physical creature, at least in conventional scientific senses of the word. On the flip side, the aforementioned giant bat of the Congo, probably just a bat. Um, maybe it's some sort of magic bat, but absent other evidence, there's probably just a bat. So yeah, that's basically what is a cryptid in a nutshell. Obviously, from the religious angle, we're more interested in those sorts of cryptids that are less worldly. Since not that the Onza or the giant bat of the Congo isn't fascinating, but it's fascinating for purely ecological and scientific reasons.
Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Zach, do you want to say something?
No, I'm here to listen and facilitate dialogue. I'm probably gonna learn as much about this from Jordan, or nearly as much as you will.
Yeah, I was just speaking with Jordan earlier how I was ignorant about this term and topic as well, and how he's helping all of us to educate us that cryptids are not necessarily just some like Bigfoot, dogman, whatever creatures that we may find in these fascinating YouTube videos, how the park rangers are encountering all these, very intimidating, anxious, scary, how they have these experiences, with this type of beings. But as he's telling us, it could be just an animal that is just an animal, and there's nothing magical or mystical about it, but they're just hidden for the eyes of the scientific world. So I just appreciate, this educational side.
Yeah.
Jordan, when it comes to creatures that we have prepared to talk about for tonight, you mentioned Bigfoot, and maybe that will be a good starting point for tonight. So, who or what is Bigfoot? How can we explain this creature if it exists at all?
Yeah, so most Bigfoot encounters describe a large, about 6 to 8 feet, give a foot or two, error, large, very hairy man who lives in the woods, exhibits strong animalian characteristics, strong mischievous characteristics, not especially malicious. As I said, it hovers in, and I put the woods with an asterisk there because the entity that's called Bigfoot has been described like basically globally. So where I live, I don't live in a wooded area. There's a Bigfoot seeking society like just down the road. And they have people who've seen Bigfoot, not in like farmers' fields. There's a Bigfoot society there are people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in Tibet. There are people who claim to have seen Bigfoot in China. The oldest reference I've encountered is in the Classic of Tea, which asserts that a very popular blend of tea in China at the time had been given to a Taoist priest by Bigfoot. He was just wandering through the woods and Bigfoot was like, tea. There's a similar story involving sake from Japan. That one's not so historical. It's in Toriyama Sekien's Hyaki Ikkyagyo. I'm sure I mispronounced that. My apologies. Ain't listening Japanese. Stories about Bigfoot from the Polynesia and New Zealand, where there are no trees at all. Stories about stories about Bigfoot from England and from Greece and even from Israel. As I said, so Wood is wrong. He's like nature or the wilds might be better, which is why certain theosophical groups have concluded he's some sort of magical nature spirit. The modern, I guess, the view of primatologists, at least primatologists who believe in Bigfoot, is he's some sort of undiscovered monkey. That's problematic for just based off his spread, right? It makes sense if we're just talking about Northwest. So, like, when people talk about Bigfoot, they often just talk about him as if he lived in Cascadia, right? New Brunswick, British Columbia, down into like Oregon, Washington State, maybe parts of North California, parts of Idaho, the whole boreal, the forests in that particular area. Belief in an undiscovered ape man or even some kind of mythical bear becomes more problematic once we start moving into south and into like Australia. Like there's been Bigfoot sightings in Australia where there is no forest for an undiscovered ape to hide in. This has led many to conclude that Bigfoot is probably not some kind of monkey. The main contender, I guess, is what we might call the, I'm going to be a little rude or overgeneralizing, and I'm going to call it the Fortean view. Charles Fort was he was a Victorian investigator of the weird, basically, and his modus operandi, he was a holist, HOLIST, so somebody, as opposed to a reductivist, to somebody who only looks at the most narrow set of cases. He wanted to look at the totality of cases. And so his theory was, if he took all of the facts that had been rejected by modern science and stuffed them into one book, that he would reach a greater vision of the world, basically. So his books are full of they're full of just really strange, like flying wheels of light, rains of blood, gelatinous clouds in the sky. That's another fun one. A lot of it discusses meteorites, which were still being scientifically argued over at the time. Stuff like some of what's in his books we look at and we go, oh, but that stuff obviously exists. Not so obvious back then. His followers have continued this legacy and have developed a sort of discipline or methodology centered around picking the strangest claims. And then they sort of compile these strange claims into books. This has its pros and cons. The pro is, this is data. We can't just neglect the data because it's weird. And some of the data does tell us important facts about Bigfoot. The con is, these are the most weirdest Bigfoot encounters you've ever seen. And most of them read like the people involved were on crack. To be a little rude, a little like very like Bigfoot in a spaceship, or Bigfoot like flying through walls, or like one where he shows up and he's wearing a space helmet and he's like eating a cow, and then he starts playing music, like very bizarre encounters. And you know, we don't want to dismiss those encounters unless we find good reason to think they're false. But we'll just accept, for the sake of argument, that these encounters are just as reliable as Big Man the ape standing in the woods going, "Hey, folks." But at the same time, the problem with these books is if we just focus on weird Bigfoot encounters, they'll occlude the fact that the stunning majority, 99% of all Bigfoot encounters I have read or personally recorded, because I've spoken to hundreds of people about not just Bigfoot, but other topics, supernatural topics over the years, involve a completely harmless ape man in the woods, / mountaintop / Australian outback. So we're a bit of an impasse if we're just going at it from established views, because the monkey / bear, sorry, I blanked for a minute, is probably not true. At the same time, a lot of the weirder views floated out there are either too implausible. I refer here to the theory that Bigfoot is a complex space alien who's secretly controlling the Pentagon, or for whatever reason are just contradicted by the vast majority of the rest of the evidence, which, as Charles Fort would have said, is just as important as the evidence that we normally neglect.
So you're saying there's like these two extreme ends of Bigfoot study. One which is like focuses it super hard on the mundanest, and then the other one that's like, what's the most extreme stories we can find, and we're just gonna record those because the other ones are boring.
Basically, my apologies. Basically, that's sort of the case. Obviously, that's going to be a bit of an oversimplification. People are probably going to be able to pull a book out of a hat that's like, no, but this one is, or some podcast that has more reasonable views. But very vaguely, yes, And then the additional problem is that these two views, the Bigfoots involved, are like almost two totally different creatures. In fact, so much so that I have seen at least one author conclude that they must be two different creatures. I cannot remember the acronym he uses for weird Bigfoot, but he basically calls it the giant hairy stinky man. As opposed, because Bigfoot of the woods, he just stands there. Like 90% of Bigfoot accounts are that the person sees him looking at them, and then like Bigfoot walks off. And there are exceptions where like Bigfoot does something that's maybe playful or maybe informative, but not usually nothing usually absurd or beyond what might be expected by, say, a rudimentarily intelligent semi-spiritual entity living in the woods. So the story with the T, little weird, not too weird. The story, on the other hand, the story flying a spaceship, very strange. And as I said, some people have concluded that they are in fact two separate entities. I consider that view more sound, just because a lot of the strange Bigfoot encounters involve plenty of other entities on like the same flying saucer or in the background. And it's more probable that it's a disguise than that it's Bigfoot the ape man, or one and the same Bigfoot, I should say.
I have a personal question before you continue talking about Bigfoot, please. So for me, as a person who doesn't know too much about this, I was always wondering, is when we talk about Bigfoot, are these creatures synonyms Yeti and Sasquatch, or these are maybe different type of cryptids, but maybe from the same family of species?
So Sasquatch is an anglicization. So it's a Native American word. For the exact tribe escapes me. I'm sorry about this. It's one of the tribes on the eastern coast ish, but it's not quite Sasquatch. They have it's an English rendering of a Native American word. It's basically synonymous with Bigfoot. The Yeti is all but certainly the same creature. At least based off everything I've read, it's identical. The Woodwoes in medieval Europe, probably the same creature. There's an ongoing argument as to the identity of what we would call the Green Man. So for anyone who doesn't know here, for hundreds and hundreds of years, until the 11th century is the earliest date here, English and West European churches in general put frescoes on the doors and parts of the borders indicating a green man. These frescoes were modeled in the real world at holidays such as May Day, when people would dress up as the Green Man. It was basically a hairy man or leafy man of the woods. Victorian folklorists looked at this and went, pagan, definitely pagan, 100% pagan, 3 bajillion% pagan. Unfortunately, archaeology has not been able to find any evidence of the Green Man prior to the Christianization of Europe. Certainly there are similarities of identity between the Green Man and different entities, but the essence of the Green Man is a thoroughly Christian figure. There was a lovely little booklet by Jeremy Hart called The Green Man, published about a decade ago on this exact topic. But as I said, I think he sort of overstates the argument for Green Man being basically a Christian invention. But that being said, Green Man may be related to the Bigfoot figure. Maybe not. It's still in debate. Probably related to the Bigfoot figure. And then if we move east, the more controversial aspects comes in when we start discussing what the Greeks called satyrs and the Jews called Searim. The satyr, people think of the satyr as a goat man nowadays, but that actually arises later in Greek iconography. Earlier iconography just depicts the satyr as really hairy. Behavior-wise, he has certain similarities to Bigfoot, but with a vastly raised-up sex drive fitting Greek tastes. The biblical Searim is also described as a hairy man. The biggest, I mean, it's mentioned once or twice in the Bible in a very, God's like, stop sacrificing to it. But that's the most famous example. It shows up in a 2nd century Jewish midrash where they talk a little bit about its nature. It's not too important for the present discussion. The lengthiest discussion on it from the time period from a Christian source is Jerome's Life of Paulus, or Life of St. Paul the Hermit, where in chapter 8, he's describing a visit to find a certain desert saint. But when the people in question get lost, this being the desert, and they are stopped by an exceptionally hairy man who mentions that in the past he was wrongfully worshipped by the pagans as a god, and he thanks heaven that now they're no longer doing this, and then he gives them the proper directions. And St. Jerome concludes this account by going, was this a demon? Oh, no, doesn't fit this. I have no idea. It doesn't look like it, doesn't act like it, but it doesn't fit anything I've ever seen.
Hey, Jordan, I have another question. Just came to my mind before you continue, so sorry for interrupting. So now when you mentioned these goat type looking demons or beings like satyrs, you're probably familiar with the ancient deity called Pan, and this was it was worshipped and deified even before Jesus and the apostles. But I'm also reminded because this deity was also popular in the times of Jesus, especially when he was going through Caesarea Philippi region, and what he calls the gates of heaven was the entrance of the cave where was Mountain Hermon located close by. And to this deity, there were sacrifices being brought to. So when you're talking about satyrs and these goat demons or beings, I don't know why, but quickly an image or a thought went through my mind about a god Pan. So can he or it be maybe the god of these creatures, or is there any similarity or any connection between Pan and then satyrs and these goat-like furry creatures?
So questions of identity in an ancient pagan context are exceptionally convoluted. For the very simple reason that our vision of ancient, like Greco-Roman paganism, is like it's almost entirely literary, and those literary records are, I don't want to say confabulations, but they're sort of later assemblages of very disparate material, just sort of assembled by Greek and Roman poets with the assumption that it referred to some overarching mythology that's sometimes and often not the case. This is especially brutal in the case of Pan. As I think it was Cicero notes, it might be a different Roman theologian. There were like a dozen different god Pans. Like we can talk about everything from like the Pan that most people think of, who just waltzes around like having sex with nymphs, to a sort of there was a Pan of the mist of the Orphics, who was he was the anthropological embodiment of man. We can get into that later because some early Christian sources actually touch on that one, chiefly Clement and to a lesser extent Eusebius. But he's definitely not the same entity as like the Pan of popular myth. And then we can further break this down into like there's the Pan of is it the Aeneid? No, sorry, Ovid. Pan of Ovid. That's a totally different entity. or at least it's totally different identity, I should say. And then, of course, there's also Ovid's Fasti. So, sorry, yeah, correct author, but Ovid wrote a work on Roman holidays. That's one of our best sources on Roman folklore, and in it he talks about how Pan tricked Zeus to help the Romans build Rome, along with the woodpecker god. Nobody remembers. And then, of course, you have the satyr Marsyas. Famous, he's best known for having challenged Apollo to a musical contest, where he wanted to play. I want to say the pipe. It was definitely some sort of like woodwind instrument, and Apollo played the lute. And when Apollo realized he was losing, he's like, fine. But the victor can't just be decided by who has musical skill. It has to be decided by who has singing skill. And obviously, you can't sing while you're playing a pipe. Marsyas was flayed alive. What many people don't know is this wasn't an arbitrary story. This was the Hieros Logos describing how Marsyas turned into a river god. So he underwent the pagan equivalent of theosis, attained deity status. This is connected to a couple post-Jesus mystery cults, and one possibly pre-Jesus one, but of course.
So basically, like you said, because this topic is so vague and because there are so many deities called Pan, and their description doesn't match, so we can't make with certain, we cannot be so certain that Pan was somehow related to satyrs. Maybe just the goat kind of description of his personality or body, or the whole body image or face. Maybe they have something in common like that. But from what I'm getting from you is like that they're not connected in any more intimate way than that.
It's probably the same sort of entity, but saying like Pan's the ruler of the satyrs, or Pan, like talking about a relation would be convoluted. There's very little archaeological evidence that the satyrs followed Pan's orders as such. Like I wouldn't want to say he's in any. I mean, like obviously our poetry is like, yeah, Pan, Lord of the Satyrs, but then there's also Silenus and Rusticus and Faunus. And all of these are sort of like squooshed together in like the medley of syncretism and union that was so characteristic of late antique paganism, but like sort of same entity. It would be, but it might be better to just think of him as like a deified satyr.
And for some reason, please correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of these goat type deities, they're all almost obsessed with sex, correct? So there's something to it. Like there's almost like this. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing, but from what I'm understanding and receiving from from the material that you're giving to us, is that there could be one entity or maybe similar entities. They're just called by different names, and they have some things in common. Some things are differently portrayed in the ancient literature. Fine, but like at least one of the things they have in common is that they're obsessed with sex, and it just reminds me of the biblical description of how different Yahweh, Elohim, is compared to all these fallen or fake gods, and it's just amazing how God is so much different than them.
So that's probably an accident of survival. So just for anyone who doesn't know history or historical terms, an accident of survival very briefly connotes something that's, for whatever reason, it's made its way down to us, whereas something else hasn't, but it might not be representative. Outside of Greece and Rome, you don't see that obsession. Not that you never see sexual stories about Bigfoot, but you don't find that monomaniacal obsession. The connection with sex in the Greek corpus is probably due to the fact that the Greek corpus as a whole is obsessed with sex. Like all of their truly depressing, but also B, before Plato was born, Athenian poetic customs shifted such that before the performance of tragedies, they performed very lewd plays with satyrs. Due to the exceptionally conservative, not in a political, in a sense of like staying true to the past, nature of Greco-Roman religion, like later Greeks and Romans just copied verbatim a lot of earlier stuff. Like if you read Greek and Roman encounters, you will find hundreds of the same things just repeated ad nauseum by later authors, quoting earlier authors endlessly. The Romans were terrible for this. And as such, certain features of satyrs have almost certainly, in a Greek and Roman context, been grossly exaggerated compared to, say, what they actually might show up as. So if you're studying, unfortunately, we have very few, the word for a supernatural encounter in folkloristics is a memorit. We have very few memorits involving satyrs from Greece and Rome, but not one of the ones I've seen involve sex.
Yeah, then what I'm understanding now is that based on the cultural context of the Greeks and Romans, because they had a lot of similarities. For example, Romans took Greek gods and changed their names, but their descriptions stayed the same. Then it makes sense that the ancient Greeks and Romans invented some of the deities, or maybe used the already fallen existing deities by ascribing to them so much of the human characteristics which people of that time, the contemporaries of the ancient Greeks and Romans, used to practice among each other, let's say sexual immorality. So maybe they would, how God made us in our image. So maybe the ancient Romans and Greeks made their divinities or their gods and goddesses into the image of people who are practicing these things. So then it makes sense for them that their gods were drinking wine, their gods practice sexual immorality and many other things, because people of that time lived in that circumstance. So it was normal for them to have god or goddess that is similar to them.
Possibly. I wouldn't want to go too far on that, just because there is enough evidence for practical activities in Greco-Roman paganism that I wouldn't want to accuse them of just making stuff up. I will just say that our survivals on satyrs in Orthodox Greco-Roman religion are intended to be comical. They're not intended to act as a blueprint. Not that I'm going to die on the hill that the ancient Greek and Roman pagans had amazing sexual relations, but I am pretty confident in saying that like satiric behavior is grossly over-exaggerated for purposes of comedy. That's what the original meaning of satyr play was, and as such, details like that, I'm not sure. Like, as I people made sacrifices to the rural gods, but folk religion and state cult there was a hard line division. And so I'm not sure the sexual immorality part played a major role at the bottom level, especially because of the socially deleterious effects of the type of sexual immorality that would entail if people behaved like that. And then, of course, if we're talking about some of the more secretive Greco-Roman groups, which went more intensely, there's no evidence for sexual immorality at all. Maybe it occurred, but we just can't say.
Yeah, thank you for all that. Like I said, I didn't plan to ask these questions, but as I'm listening, I'm curious, and I know we went a little bit off the topic, but I don't mind. Okay, before we go to another type of cryptid or cryptoid creature, is there anything else you would like to share with us when it comes to Bigfoot? It can be any source, it can be any maybe eyewitness report, it can be description, physical, spiritual, whatever. Because like you said, they're like eyewitness reports. One was mentioning ape-like creature, which is harmless. There's also reports of something that is more mysterious and spiritual. So, feel free to add anything on top of that.
Yeah, so I guess my conclusion from all this was that there are two entities. One a demon in a malicious demon in disguise, which is the one that shows up in the spaceship or whatever, and is like, I control the Pentagon or the United States or whatever. Like very, I don't want to get too into it because it's lashon hara, negative speech, but very strange encounters. The other one, mostly harmless. There's no reason to think it's demonic in any malignant sense of the word. Like this is going to be a bit of a disconnect here because I guess the Hebrew word for demon, shadim, does not necessarily connote an evil spirit, a ruach ra. As far as Jews are concerned, there are evil spirits. Let's just be clear here. Some people are like, oh, Judaism doesn't believe in evil spirits. That's not true. It does. Ruach ra are evil. But like shadim as a whole, not necessarily so. And the Seyarim are not included under ruach ra as a category. Obviously, I'm not going to, like, Bigfoot could be evil there could be evil big feet, but as a category, I'm not going to say it's a malignant spirit, both religiously and also because, as I said, like having read thousands of encounters and spoken to quite a few people, many of them like quite sane and quite religious, there's just not much evidence to think that it's malignant, not in any spiritual sense. If you want to talk about a life of the spirit, I guess just think follow the normal norm, like judge righteously, behave with charity towards your fellows, so on and so forth. I have my issues with Jerome, but I think he was being reasonable enough when he said in response in his life of Paulus.
Hey, Jordan, I have one comment from Matt, and I think it's an interesting one, so maybe you can give a comment. He said that he read once that Constantine, the Roman emperor, right? He once traveled to Syria to see the skeleton of a satyr that was discovered in a salt mine. Are you familiar with this story? Is it a legend? Do we have any data?
There's a couple such stories. Oh, sorry. Apologies about that. There's a couple stories about that. There's one about centaurs. They're really funny. I have no idea what to like. We don't, unfortunately, with all purported discoveries of skeletons of supernatural entities, it has not come down to us. That would be nice. The skeptical approach is that it was either a cobbled together body or the body of someone with severe genetic or malnutritional defects. That might be plausible. And according to that particular story, they caught it alive. But as I said, it's hard to say. Here, we're going to Socrates' famous virtue of aporia. I don't know. I think the story about maybe not the story about Constantine in specific, but I do think there were probably skeletons that were exhibited as being from satyrs, whether they were or not.
Yeah,
we can't say.
Yeah, I believe the Constantine story was actually mentioned right after the encounter in the life of Paulus. Like Jerome's like, yeah. He met this dude. And by the way, Constantine went up to the city to see this cool skeleton they found.
Yeah, that might be it. My source for much of the Memorit encounter in the Greco-Roman lore, other than reading all of the books myself, is William Hansen's Greek and Roman folk tales, myths, and legends. It is a really long name, but the gist is it's a book of Greek folk tales. He takes the view that they weren't real, but he cites Adrian Mayer, who's not the greatest source. So, as I said, aporia here. Personally, I doubt it was a satyr skeleton, but I'm not going to deny it.
Yeah, Jordan, because we've been corresponding back and forth lately, and I'm so thankful to get to know you. And I have to thank Zechariah for introducing me to you and to your vast knowledge. And in the meantime, you have been recommending a lot of good scholarly books. And one of the books that I bought is about werewolves. And because I just got it, I couldn't go through it. But we came to the favorite topic of mine when it comes to tonight's just the whole episode. Uh, when we're talking about werewolves, can we first maybe try to make not just to explain and give description of who these what these beings are, but can we first maybe start by saying if these creatures are cryptids or they belong to some other category?
Yeah. So werewolves, like I sometimes see them included as cryptids. That's mostly a misunderstanding. People aren't familiar with the werewolf literature and assume that a werewolf is like, if anyone here's watched Harry Potter, where he turns into a wolf, he has like the top parts of a wolf and he has the claws and he's walking around on legs as some sort of wolf man. That's what people tend to think of, and thus it sort of makes its way into cryptozoology. That's a mistake. Properly speaking, a werewolf is a man who turns, we'll see why I put scare quotes there, into an actual wolf. There's sometimes details that like let you tell him apart from normal wolves, but they tend to be things like he was really big, he had glowing eyes, he had glowing, like just things that make it obvious it's a spiritual entity rather than you had one too many beers and saw a wolf and got scared. So not a cryptid. As I said, like often gets included by connoisseurs of the weird as a cryptid, but properly speaking, werewolfism is, I'm going to use metaphysical activity here as a sort of byword for actions humans can do at a transmundane level, because I don't want to use loaded terms like sorcery or magic, because there's also like miracle working, sort of all sorts of like doing miracles, exorcism. There's all kinds of metaphysical activities we can do that aren't sorcery. And just maybe werewolfism is sorcery, but before we say that, I would like to prove it rather than simply assume it, if that makes sense. So werewolfism is, that book is by Claude Lecouteux. It's one of two books he wrote on werewolves. The one you have is his translations of the major memoirs. So again, supernatural encounters involving werewolves. Most of them, some of them folklore, but many of them trial records. So these aren't like, oh, I heard from a friend who heard from a friend. These are jurists recording often things like sometimes solicited by torture. There's a couple ones in that book that are absolutely someone who's just really mentally ill, but sometimes given freely by people who were completely sane. His second book, which is Werewolves and Fairies, goes into, well, what is a werewolf more in detail. It's one of several very good books published by scholars on the European werewolf lore prior to 1900. The other two really good overviews are Carlo Ginzburg's Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath. Oh, yeah, that one's good too, but that one's more encounters. And then there's Daniel Ogden's The Werewolf in the Ancient World. Much of what I'm about to say is partially drawn from them, but it's also drawn from a lot of more recent literature on shamanism and some Chinese records, but the Chinese werewolf material hasn't been translated well, unfortunately. So yeah, werewolf it's a form of metaphysical activity where, in brief, your soul leaves your body in the form of a wolf. For parallels, I guess, like soul flight or soul ascension is very common in religious literature. It shows up several times in the books of the prophets. Ezekiel is like, I was taken out of my body. We see that also in the Revelation of John, right? He's like, was taken out of my body, flew, was standing around and whooped into heaven. As it shows up in all sorts of other religions, often initiated intentionally. In the case of werewolfism, it was intentional, but it was intentional in the manifested form of an animal. The aim being to assume some traits. Well, so I shouldn't say the aim in a categorical sense, because people tried to do these things for different reasons. So, for example, there's a reasonable enough body of evidence that Norse berserkers may have left their bodies in the form of wolves or bears to channel the savagery of wolves and bears. In a Greco-Roman context, the purpose was very different. The werewolf rites of the Etruscans and possibly the Arcadians, there's still an academic dispute there, but we'll just say the Arcadians because more data is better data, was not intended to be savage and go around wreaking havoc, but rather to control man's animal nature as a way of elevating man up to the gods. That's the Greco-Roman / Etruscan, which has some similarities to Roman, but very, very different. Other shamanic or animal transfers are also different. Inuit shamans doing that sort of thing are intending to channel more positive traits of the animal in question. Sometimes there's belief that the animal in question can serve a healing capacity. This one especially shows up with, I'm going to call it Christian shamanism, for lack of a better word, where I'm going to savage my enemies is not religiously approved of. I don't know why. Nothing about that in Jesus. He never said anything about not savaging your enemies in the form of a wolf. But yeah, basically, it's not a cryptid. There are. The idea that it's a physical animal is usually contradicted both by the accounts themselves, where the people will often see the person's body at the same time as they see the werewolf, and they'll notice a sort of sympathy between the two. But it's also contradicted by interviews with people who claim to have done this, whether we want to believe them or not, where again they describe it as soul flight. We can talk about some of the shamanic material, or I can talk about.
Yeah, I would like first to ask a question because again, I believe not just myself, but that the audience would love to know because we are ignorant about these topics, and you know so much. So my question is, when it comes to this soul flight theory, can you please explain the theory in more details? Like, is it that a person or a second person would summon an animal spirit or a soul to the human spirit, and they will somehow combine? How would this work?
So that's going to how is going to vary slightly based off your religion. So I'm just going to cycle through really quick several different religions' visions of the soul. The Chinese, you have like 10 souls. You like I'm going to get the number wrong. You have like 7 Poes and 3 Huns or something like that. 4 Po, some huge figure of souls. The only thing that we need to know here is the bottom is, so half of your souls come from heaven, the other half come from earth. It's the earth ones that turn into a werewolf, if you're doing Chinese werewolfism. And as I said, there's not a lot on that, and it's convoluted. In the Norse context, it's just they call it your, like the terms used in the ancient Norse are sort of ambiguous. Again, the implication is it's a lower soul, but since the number of souls in the Norse are argued about, it's hard to say. In general, it's either your soul if you think you have one, or your like animal soul if you think you have 2 or more. So in a Greek context, you have 3 souls, right? These are the famous. They show best well known for Aristotle, but he's not inventing them out of a hat. The rational soul, the animal soul, the vegetative soul. It would be the rational soul that you'd want to use here. Ogden talks about how sort of there's a relationship between werewolfism and having a hairy heart in Greek literature. as I say, in more recent shamanic literature is usually collected from cultures that have been heavily Christianized, and individuals tend to believe they have one soul, so they say it's their soul turning into an animal. But in terms of an animal spirit coming down, there's basically nothing, with one possible exception. In the exceptionally fraught area of Nahuatl studies, so the studies of the people that used to be called the Aztecs, that included the Aztecs, I should say, the Nahuatl, there's an activity called Nagualism. And in Nagualism, it is your soul, but your ability to do that is conferred by a special animal spirit that joins you at birth and determines what you can turn into. But as I said, Nagualism is there's an ongoing dispute. One of the issues with Nagualism is we have very, very few records. We do have records from before the Spanish conquest. Like some did survive, but much of it is from after the conquest, especially the religious stuff. And part of the dispute is contemporary Nahuatl werewolf. I'm going to call them werewolves. Strictly speaking, they turn into like coyotes or butterflies or rabbits or all other animals, but we'll just call them werewolves. Say they're Christian. They say they're Christian. They've held their Christian for centuries. How seriously do we take this claim? Because there's actually three ways we can take it, right? We can assume they're lying to avoid persecution by church authorities. We can assume they're correct, they are sincere but deluded. These are all more, say, in line with historic demonology. The third approach is that they are both sincere and have, as best they can, thought this out. So when they say, I'm doing Christian werewolfism, they're not lying and they're not kooky. And in defense of this hypothesis, it's worth noting that in the 15 and 1600s, Catholic inquisitors in Poland, parts of Germany, parts of Hungary, and parts of Italy tripped over a number of groups of individuals who claimed that they turned into animals of one sort or another. In Italy, it was like butterflies and rabbits. In Poland and Germany, it was werewolves. The famous T.S. of Kaltenbrunn, but there are a couple others that show up in the records. They argued with the inquisitors. When they were brought in and accused of heresy, they argued, and they brought scripture up in defense, and they were never recanted, funnily enough. I shouldn't say some of them did recant because they didn't like being tortured, but from the perspective of strict argument, they did not, in fact, recant their position that they were engaging in serious Christian werewolfism. And battling witches, in the case of T.S. of Kaltenbrunn, fighting Satan himself, which is an impressive claim.
So Jordan, before you continue, would it be safe to, maybe not give a conclusion, but would it be safe to say that in this context and in this interpretation, werewolfism would work by a person who wanted to change, transform temporarily, would either do some incantation or magical ritual or do a spell, or would maybe hire or ask for help someone else who is able to do that, so that for a temporary time of, doesn't matter, 5-10 hours, really the time doesn't matter, this person would transform into what they're not something naturally, and this will happen by the two souls of animal and the human soul as a host would somehow merge and work, and they, at a certain time when the spell or the ritual would stop working, usually in movies it's like when the moon is, when the night is over, the morning comes, and then this animal soul would depart and human person would come to his own senses. Is this safe to say that when it comes to this interpretation, this is a decent summary of what you've been saying?
Sort of. So there's two aspects. The first is the soul question. Jews believe in multiple souls. You have multiple souls. So when I say your animal soul, I'm not meaning like some weird thing that comes and joins you. It's with you at birth. It's just as much part of you as your higher rational soul. Not like rectifying it is very important in Jewish religion, not in the sense that everyone has to go out and become a werewolf for obvious reasons. Just go to your local synagogue and test that claim out, but in the sense that our animal soul controls a number of our appetitive faculties and our emotional faculties, and trying to suppress those leads us away from God, because God made that soul just as much as he made the higher soul. That's the Jewish view. Various other religions have not identical but comparable views in the case of Taoism and the Norsemen and the Greeks. Like the Jewish view here is very in line with New Eastern views. If you think it's one soul, I suppose you could say it's an animal soul joining. As I said, that's with the possible exception of the Aztec encounters, that's convoluted. In terms of how, there's a few different methods. I'm not going to give the full details on this show because I don't think you want me to. One of them is chemical. Unfortunately, it's recorded in Christian witch hunting manuals. I have the whole thing upstairs. Skeptics argued it worked hallucinogenically. Unfortunately, that claim has been tested and resoundingly, I won't say disproven, but it remains in interminable dispute land, and frankly has more to do with your a priori metaphysical assumptions about the existence of werewolves than anything else. But making a decoction of certain herbs. Others involved. There are certain ritual apparatuses involved in a lot of this. I don't like spells or incantations. It's always hard. Like, what do we call a spell or an incantation? The only surviving methods I've encountered in the Nahuatl material are Christian prayers. He's praying to Jesus. Spell. Maybe it's a spell or incantation, but it is a Christian prayer. In the case of maybe some of the Taoist material, you might recite what we might call a spell, but they would call chants or mudras or sealing, depending on their specific branch or context. In the Greco-Roman case, you basically did it through the Nietzschean power of will. You were like, will macht zur, or will zur macht, I'm doing this. Like the Etruscan werewolves would walk over coals and try to affect the transformation during that period. Unfortunately, as I said, the Greek rites remain a matter of dispute, and particulars are foreign to us. So as I said, maybe we might say spells. That gets into a much wider context about how do we define spells and incantations. But for the purposes of, I guess, discussion, you're going to say something. Yeah, probably.
And I know that you said because there are two different types of Bigfoot, and one is harmless, one is harmful. What can we say about werewolves? Of course, if they do exist through whatever means and sorts or whatever. But when it comes to the history, when it comes to tradition, lore, and some scholarly sources, are they always recording that werewolves would be evil, attacking, killing people, killing animals, drinking their blood, eating their flesh? Is it always something of that sort?
No. Sometimes yes. It's definitely true that societies that believed in and practiced werewolfism did not believe it was a bed of roses. But by the same token, they were not, like, accepting the Norse, where it was, if it existed, as I said, there's going to be some academic who's like, no. But if it existed in the Norse case, it was used mostly militarily. In the case of the Mexican and or Mexican and North American, Mexican and American natives, not so much. Like we know for a fact that turning into a werewolf just to attack other people was seen as a form of sorcery. Bearing in mind that they did have a distinction between white magic and black magic, or natural, like whatever terms you want to pick, good and bad, and sorcery's bad. You could see, even in the Aztec Empire, you could seriously suffer for doing sorcery. Human hearts are okay though. But as I said, like in a strict sense, harmful. It's going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on why they're doing it. Same as any other human activity, really. It's like, what's the difference between keeping a gun, right? You know, some people go and shoot up all their neighbors, and others do it for fun or because they want to hunt animals, or arts like sword fighting. I know a few people who do sword fighting. Most of them have never decapitated someone. Actually, all of them have never decapitated someone, or they'd be in prison right now. It's all going to depend. We might say something else spiritually. Like we might be tempted to reach a don't turn into a werewolf conclusion spiritually, but in terms of if werewolfism is being done, are people going to be dying left and right? The answer is no. Or at least no, depending.
Okay, so you said that you've been reading some scholarly sources which once when they mention werewolves, it wouldn't always end in a tragic way for any other person. It doesn't mean that this transformation would always happen because, you know, there's a vengeance, or there's like a hunger, like we see in movies and in novels, so the werewolf has to kill and eat. So it wouldn't, so in more scholarly sources that you've been dealing with, it doesn't always end with this, correct?
No. As I said, there's going to be individual exceptions. The Norse are particularly outstanding here. Sorry for anyone who really loves Norse civilization, but like in a native, so amongst Inuit, the main reason you would undergo that sort of activity if you're a practicing Inuit shaman was because there was a problem with the food supply. And the Inuit believed that the food supply were controlled by like a spiritual. So the Inuit believed that everything has a soul. And the souls of certain classes of animals are ruled over by specific animals. And the main reason you're going to do this if you're an Inuit shaman is not because you want to go with savaging people, but because you want to find the king of the local food supply, or a certain Inuit spirit called Sedna, who we can push to the side for the moment. We're going to come back to her because I think we want to touch briefly on dogmen, and she shows up there. But Sedna, and you're basically going to be like, so, about that food supply. Southern Mexican natives and American, bit more different. There was a poorly documented, or increasingly well exposed, I should say, dispute about good werewolves in early medieval England. So to contextualize this very briefly for people here, the witchcraft and demons are real and they can kill you was not a view taken by the church until the very, very late 14th century. Legally speaking, that is. Like there's all sorts of demons running around and they're going to assault you. It's more of a Renaissance view, and very much so a Reformation view. People always talk about the witch trials as if they were medieval. That's not true. Most of them were between 1560 and 1660, and the portion that were before then were in the definite minority, at least in Western Europe. Different matter if it's Eastern Europe, but we can push that to the side for the moment. So because of this, there was a brief period in the middle of the Middle Ages, so around the turn of 10,000 to about 1250, where a number of Christians did debate about werewolves bringing up examples of werewolves who were completely harmless, for one, or even in some cases, very loyal servants of the monarch, or someone else. In the last case, that one's a romance. It's not a historical encounter, but it still testifies to an ongoing dispute. Unfortunately, the main source on that one is rather hard to find in English. It is, let me just find the name here. Oh, Jesus. I wrote this all down. Oh, here we go. Jeffrey Allen Massey, Corpus Lupi, The Medieval Werewolf and Popular Theology. I have some issues with that particular academic manuscript, but it like very recent and sort of talks about on disputes regarding werewolfism as an activity and specifically comparisons between the werewolf and the Eucharist. It's a little hard to find, unfortunately, so it would be hard for people to vet me here, but like that was an ongoing dispute in the Middle Ages and then just sort of tapered out. But yeah, like some European basis for harmless werewolves too. In the case of the Greco-Roman material, it's decisively harmless to the extent that we believe in it.
Can you please shed some light on that? I'm super interested, like in just learning, at least if it takes only a minute, of that story between the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper and the werewolf being a werewolf. How is that related in that context, in that story of the medieval Europe? Can you please explain?
It's mostly it's metaphysics. No, it's not like werewolves are. So I shouldn't say it's not that werewolves eat the Eucharist, because there is one really strange folk tale. Who recorded it? Somebody recorded a memorit in which he was asked to officiate at a werewolf baptism or a wolf baptism. I shouldn't say werewolf in that case because it was just, and somebody was carrying around a Eucharist, but putting aside that one specific encounter, it's not so much the werewolf. It's not that werewolves were running around with the Eucharist. It's that in both cases, we have something that's putatively one thing, man, bread, but is in essence something else, wolf, Jesus. And the dispute was weird supernatural entities have always been used by everyone, basically across all of humanity, as a sort of springboard for theological reflection on the nature of man and God and animal. So as like at the exact same time that Christians were debating this, Jews were having a very identical debate regarding the relationship between man's rational and man's animal soul, which occurred, like Jews and Christians did speak to each other more than is commonly assumed, but obviously the parameters are different because Jews don't eat the Eucharist. The best, like this, there was a very... It was a Jewish mystic called Rabbi Eliezer of Worms who recorded the most extensively about werewolves. And as it became very infamous about half a decade ago when Rabbi Zechariah Wallerstein, Zeitel, spoke about his accounts of meeting werewolves, and he was like, this is Torah. And a whole bunch of rational skeptics were like, we're going to fight now. You're not allowed to say that werewolves are in the Torah. We need the Torah to be nice and rational, and it can't have werewolves in it. But yeah, like medieval discussions of monsters, and I'm talking not just like Christian, but also Jewish and Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, like in an ecumenical dialogue, had less to do with the monster itself and like talking about like the nature of the monster, like we'll say we are, and more to do with, well, what does this reveal about the world God created for us? This is why the medieval rabbis debated flying camels.
Okay, I would just like to say a couple things before you continue, please. When you were mentioning like the dog-like creature or the wolf man in the medieval Europe, I was reminded of this tale which I would love to read more about, of this supposedly Christian saint called Saint Christopher, who is depicted as having had like a wolf. So I can't say more about this, because even when I heard about this story before, and I don't know if I ordered the comic book, because Eastern Orthodox Church released one of the comic books on this topic of Saint Christopher, like serving in God's army, but for some reason he was portrayed as a wolfman. So that went through my mind. But also when you talked about werewolves and Tanakh, or the Bible, I was just reminded of the King Nebuchadnezzar, which is very hard for me to pronounce because in my language we say it differently. Even though he was not a werewolf, he was the closest thing in the Bible you can see as werewolf. I mean, he wasn't killing and drinking people, or eating people and drinking their blood. But that was, for me at least, the closest to the werewolf in the Bible, because he was turned to something that resembles to that state, at least partially, not fully, of course, but partially. So I just wanted to mention King Nebuchadnezzar and Saint Christopher, when it comes to this topic, because I think both are very interesting characters.
Yeah, Saint Christ. I don't know an awful lot about Saint Christopher. Like, he is depicted with a dog's head very early on. There are a few other Christian saints that have very distinct connections to animals. Very distinct connection to wolves in specific. There's all sorts of Christian saints who connect to animals. Saint Blaise of France and Saint Francis of Assisi are going to be the two most well-known here. In both cases, the issue is less connected to... I won't say it's not connected to the supernatural wolf, because it is, but first and foremost, it's sort of connected to the question of what are wolves? Because in the Greek mind, so this is going back way back here. In the Greek mind, the wolf was a fascinating creature because on the one hand, it perfectly embodied wildness and bestiality in the sense of savaging things, not in the sense of in the other sense, but on the other hand, the wolf was and is exceptionally social, very friendly, bonds well with humans. Heck, anyone who owns a dog has seen this firsthand. Like the wolf, so it's this amazingly versatile animal that sort of embodies the two most extremes of nature in one figure. And the one who talks the most extensively about this was a figure of the second sophistic alien, who talks very, very extensively about wolves and held a very high opinion of them. And he had a huge influence on Christian theology, or Christian bestiaries, sorry, I should say. Like he talked... Sorry, lost my train of thought for a moment. His depictions of animals in his natural history or history of animals? Oh, that's embarrassing. Okay, it's a 3-volume series on animals. You can buy it in English from Loeb. Lovely work. Lots of really strange stuff in there. Fun to quote. He takes Aristotle's dictum that mice can eat through iron on the Cyclades seriously. I always like to send that one to people when debating Aristotelianism. But his views on wolves in particular had a profound influence on Christianity. And when I mentioned discussions about, like, are there good werewolves, it had mostly to do with, like, man is, on the one hand, man is made in the image of God. Right, man is exceptionally holy, as Jesus himself says, John 10:34. I say to ye are gods. Right, man is a god in the body of an animal, but he's in the body of an animal, and he's in a fallen state, and so where the werewolf tends to enter when we look at theological speculation, both from Jews and Christians. I'm sure there's a Muslim writing about werewolves somewhere. I haven't come across them yet. But from the Jewish and Christian perspective, is the werewolf almost perfectly embodies this paradoxical duality of man. like we're getting into weird. It's like, yeah, it's like you're like, oh, we're going to talk about cryptids like Bigfoot, and now I'm like, yeah, the holy wolf man. So, but no, it's like to various Christian theologians, and to Jewish theologians, the werewolf or the wolf, sans any man involved, sort of embodies this strange duality between the best part of ourselves and the worst. This shows up. I'm not going to say it shows up in St. Christopher. It probably does, but it definitely shows up with the famous story of St. Francis of Assisi taming the wolf, where it's savaging the crops and it's just doing all this havoc. And he shows up and he's like, hey. And we don't know what he does, but he gets the wolf. He comes back to the town with the wolf and he's like, don't worry. It's harmless now, and the wolf protects the townspeople for like 10 years before it dies a natural death of old age, and the townspeople deeply mourn and bury the wolf. The importance of this story from the perspective of our studies of medieval Christianity and wolves is not so much did this happen at a historical level, but what this says about St. Francis's spiritual mission, and also how we view animality, right? Because he could have just killed the wolf, right? Like if St. Francis had killed the wolf, nobody would sit here going, oh, what a douche, right? We would just look at it and be like, oh, yeah, the wolf was savaging the crop, so he took it out. But he didn't kill the wolf. He saved the wolf, literally. Turned him into a servant of God. The story of St. Blaise is less explicitly connected to wolves, but it's very similar. He lived a wild, wild life. Like a bestial life prior to meeting Saint Hilarion, the hilarious saint. And after being converted to the cause of Jesus, the funny thing is he lived a super bestial life beforehand, but after coming to Jesus, he still lives a super bestial life, but as a hairy man living in caves in the wild. So the connection, like there's not a great connection between Saint Blaise and werewolves. I read a really not fun book that made that case. It's like, oh, Blaise means wolf. Yes, but it's more that like the bestial aspects of the wolf are sort of refracted through the hagiography of St. Blaise. And saying, St. Blaise was a historical person. He founded the convent system in France. He might be the patron saint of the country. Somebody is welcome to correct me on that if there's a different saint. But yeah, as I said, it's a dispute on the nature of animality that tends to refract into werewolves, rather than like I wouldn't say St. Christopher's a werewolf.
Jordan, before I ask you to say something about dogman, can we say that other creatures and other events where something besides werewolfism will happen? So at least we see this in movies, in comic books, in novels, in all sorts of works of fiction. We don't see just a werewolf. Sometimes we see this creature called werebear, or different things that always start with were. Can we say that this is the same manifestation, the same event, the same process of transformation, where another animal and that soul of that type of animal would merge with man? So it's the same thing, the same process, the same event, but just different type of animal that is not wolf.
Yeah. So yeah, werebears show up in the Norse material. And there's a controversial and ongoing case about the Greek material that I don't want to touch. Maybe is the answer there. They do show up in some Native American cultures. We also see butterflies, rabbits, tigers in India and China. We do see werewolves in China, but they exist with tigers. My all-time favorite werewolf encounter actually isn't a wolf, it's a chicken. In the 3rd century, a Chinese priest did battle with a were-chicken. That was savaging. I think it was the 3rd, might have been the 4th or 5th AD. It was like this evil were-chicken, and it attacked him, and he beat it off.
I honestly wish you were joking. It's like I love stories of fiction, and I also, on the other side, love academic work. But this last thing about the were chicken, that doesn't belong in either. That just belongs in someone's either nightmare, or someone was eating too much forbidden mushrooms. Someone's doing something they're not supposed to if they encountered a were chicken. I don't know. I don't care if it comes from a religious person, including priest. That was either something demonic, or that person was on something that was forbidden. But you know why I mentioned the werebear? Because when you talked earlier about Norsemen and being a berserker, let's say these things really happen. I don't know, but I'm just saying, let's say these things really happen, and that something came into the being or heart or mind or soul of these Norsemen before they would go to have warfare with other people. The way they would be portrayed as how their voices would sound like, their abnormal strength. That sounds more like werebear than werewolf. So that came through my mind once when you were talking about the Norsemen earlier.
Yeah, so the two best known examples of what we might call werewolfism in the Norse context do involve bears. It was a battle between like two farmers where one turned into a wolf and one turned into a bear. And then there's another famous example where a berserker turned into a bear in the middle of the battlefield. Just for the record, the were chicken one it's a little hard to vet because the way the Chinese recorded encounters makes figuring out if they took them seriously difficult. That being said, it absolutely was like he killed the thing. He was like, no, this shouldn't be here. Then there's another aspect there because it was also a dispute between two ethnicities at the time. So some scholars are like, well, maybe it wasn't a chicken. But I mean, where butterflies. Yeah, I'm not going to die on the hill that one happened. It's one of those. But it is just worth noting that like we sit here and we're like, oh, supernatural encounters must be super meaningful, right? Not necessarily. There are some really, really goofy supernatural encounters out there that are much better defended than a lot of more sensible ones.
Hey, when it comes to the were chicken, I would say video or it didn't happen. Okay, can we please switch to a subtopic of werewolves when it comes to dogman? Because I wanted you so badly to mention these, even though you told me the other day, oh, but these creatures are not the same like werewolves. I'm like, dang it, I keep making wrong conclusions out of ignorance. And I have no problem saying that because I love learning, I love knowledge. So can you please tell us who or what are the dogmen and why are they different than werewolves?
So I'm just going to hedge this by noting that good material on dogmen is hard to come by. There's some medieval, there's some Greek, there's some Inuit. There must be material elsewhere. Unfortunately, it is buried beneath mounds of crap, and I have not read it. The dogman, like the werewolf, is human. It's a human who turns into a wolf. The dogman was never human in the first place. The dogman is an entity that's half dog, half human. At least, like in the Greek context, it shows up as this wild tribe that lives in the distant reaches of Africa or India, where it has its own semi-humanoid civilization. Unfortunately, our Greek encounters aren't crazily in depth. There's some stuff in the medieval literature, but again, a lot of it not super in depth, and much of it romances. In an Inuit the Inuit are interesting. So the Inuit have this very important entity called Sedna. She has like dozens of other names. Like if you look her up, and I picked Sedna because I don't speak Inuktitut. And Inuit words are really, really hard to pronounce. They make Polish look like a cakewalk. But Sedna is this powerful spirit or goddess. You can pick different names here, who lives under the water and is believed to control the access of Inuit people to water animals. So if she's in a pissy mood for whatever reason, usually because she feels that the taboos, like the taboos of the ocean, so these are going to be Inuit rights, have not been or Inuit rights for controlling the relationship between man and nature have not been respected. And if that happens, she will prevent the animals from swimming within reach of Inuit nets, and a shaman has to go down to placate her. Where this connects to dogmen is in the origin myth of Sedna. Sedna, per the Inuit lore, was once this woman, and her father, who was this malicious and cruel man, forced her to marry a dog. And then he puts her on this island, and she has sex with this dog. I'm sorry, I should have put a trigger warning there. This isn't a fun story, folks. If people don't like gore, I would mute for the next 5 to 10 minutes, because she gives birth to the dogmen, which, and then she also gives birth to the white man and other native tribes. It's not, as I said, not a fun myth. Very clear political overtones to parts of this story. This story has been recounted by both the Greenlandic Inuit and the Canadian Inuit, who were separated for centuries because of political boundaries. Eventually, her father.
Racist.
It's not a story that lends itself to the views that the Inuit were egalitarian, is all I'll say. As I said, I don't think this story is believed nowadays, is all I'll say. But yeah, she gives birth. These tribes leave. The story gets tragic because her father kills her husband, the dog. He brutally murders her, and then he leaves her on this island to starve, and when she tries to climb into the boat and escape, the father smashes her fingers off, forcing her to go into the water, and she drowns, and then she becomes a sea goddess, because why not? And the rest is history. The important aspect here is of Sedna's children beyond us, the people in this call, are dogmen. And dogmen have a huge role in Inuit folklore and religious belief. They're all over the place, where again they form wild packs. They're not evil in like a satanic, I'm going to plot your destruction sense, but they're not my best friends either, shall we say. Like, they're on the low end of entities you would want to meet. That on that point, I think literature that's called the malignant is correct, because all events indicates they're harmful, but for a stabby reason.
Yeah, I have a question for both of you from my friend Mario. But before I read the question, I just want to say, again, I don't know anything about dogmen except from numerous videos I've been watching from eyewitness reports with some usually shaky, blurry cameras at night. Look at this creature. Could it be, look at its eyes. And then you see like a humanoid wolf-like creature that will be lurking and attacking people. So like you said, it may not be the most peaceful creature, but it's not satanic evil. So to me, if it exists, I have no clue. Could be just a legend, could be just someone is playing with video effects and Photoshop, whatever. But if it exists, maybe it sounds more like a territorial being, which is like just protecting, hey, this is where my nest, my cave is, and you people came camping, so I'm warning you, back off or I'll attack you. So maybe in a way like a bear or a wolf, like I'm protecting my territory and protecting my cubs, whatever. It sounds like that, but from what I understood is the main difference between werewolves and dogmen is that a werewolf is a human, like you said, that is just transforming through whatever ways and means or rituals into a wolf-like creature for a short time being, and then returns to its humanoid shape, while dogmen are 24/7. They're just these wolf-like creatures. They were never men, or even if they were, they're now permanently turned into dogmen, or dog-like creatures. Okay, the question is, it has to do with werewolves. So we're just going a little bit back. He said, "Has anyone read the book he came to set the captives free. I heard about this book by Rebecca Brown, MD, medical doctor, on her reports of werewolf shapeshifters within the satanic cult. So this is a question for both of you or either of you. If you guys have read about this book or maybe know someone who read it, do you know like a summary of the book or maybe the main thesis, and if it's verifiable? Do you guys know anything about this title?
I don't know about Zach. I've never heard of that book. Satanic. I would be wary about books talking about satanic cults. There are so there's like 3 types of Satanist groups out there. There's LaVeyan Satanists, Church of Satan, Temple of Satan types. They're horrible people. Let's just be like Church of Satan. They are awful, vicious, nasty people. Actually, like, yeah, I won't go on about them because I could rant for. Zach will vet me. He's heard me rant for hours about like just how nasty they are. But they're not Satanists in the sense that they're complete atheists. The other 2 groups are going to be just really edgy live action role players doing like what they call theistic Satanism. These people are mooks. They're not. A lot of them have very severe personal problems. I would be a little skeptical of their spiritual claims, just because they have so many mental problems. Again, not the nicest people, but I feel bad for them because, like, sometimes some of them are sane, but like groups like the Temple of the Black Light, which is an acosmic Satanist group that wants to destroy reality. Like I've met a dozen members from that group. All of them had severe mental problems. I feel bad. I don't want to go on about them just because I feel bad. And that, yeah. The third group are illegal, like genuinely illegal cults that murder individuals. I'm still going to hedge them with like those people are deeply disturbed, but in a different way. I have not read about werewolf. Okay, I've seen werewolfism show up in one group that claimed to be satanic. I have absolutely no idea. It makes me happier to think that that specific book was never actualized on, because it includes advice on rape, murder, and forcing people to go on drugs. And I would love to think that the author is just an edgy 30-year-old who never quite got over his goth phase. That could be wrong. The author of that book could be a mass murderer. But I don't like satanic cults are weird. There's a lot of problems with them and a lot of problems with the way people approach them. Not because they're good, not because they're wonderful, not because we should show up with compassion and love, but just because, again, like sometimes it's mentally ill, sometimes it's atheism, which is its own problem, and sometimes it's something genuinely horrifying, but for reasons that are totally different to, say, Satanism in the sense of Satan worship.
Jordan, can you please clarify when you said he, like the book author could be, this or that? Can you please clarify who is the book author and what book are you talking about?
Yeah, I am talking about a book published by the Order of Nine Angles. I believe it was banned because it encourages all these illegal things. It was. Oh, he had some really edgy name. It was like Frater Necronomicus. Frater. Yeah, it's. Oh man. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can see that this
pull it up.
fake
I
name.
can pull it up real quickly if the name.
No,
of the
it's okay. I was just wondering. I don't. Yeah, I can just say that this fake name was based off of the occultic and whatever, based on his fake last name. Okay, so So
Yeah,
basically,
so
what Mario said when it comes to this book, he came to set the captives free, and the ladies all lady the lady a lady is the author of this book. She mentions werewolf shapeshifters within this cult. So if you don't know, much about werewolves when it comes to the satanic cults, is there any source that you read that you have any sorts of shapeshifters when it comes to Satanism, magic, the occult, or anything of that sort?
I mean, that sort of thing is always going to show up in the occult, right? Um, so same with herbalism, astrology, alchemy, exercise, like gymnastics. There's a whole bunch. There's a whole occult series on gymnastics, physiology, zoology. Like there absolutely are modern occult writers talking about werewolfism. Some are okay, some are not okay for some spiritual reasons or because it's hard to say. Like there are absolutely is occult werewolfism. What we might happen to think about it is going to vary based book to book. Same with occult. Like there's occult books on how to pray. The occult books on gemstone. I mean, I go to rock shows all the time. I'm always seeing people with an occult interest in rocks.
Yeah, crystals are so popular in the new age culture. Whatever. Sometimes I'm upset when I see religious people talking about crystals or horoscope or whatever, and I don't go there and tell them you should repent, you should throw this out of your house, because I don't try to uh, have this preachy spirit towards anyone, and it depends from context to context, from situation to situation. But I do get upset when I see on social media. When I say Christians, is because most of my friends who are religious, they're Christians. But I bet this is also forbidden in all monotheistic religions, including Judaism. When I see, like I said, crystals or tarot cards and or Ouija boards, whatever, and then you see people who proclaim to be any sort of believers, they dabble with these things. It just makes me upset. Jordan, uh, before I ask you something about vampires, which will be the last topic, the last subtopic in this topic of werewolves, is there anything else you would like to say about dogman, or we can just switch to the top subtopic of vampires?
Actually, I can't real quickly. Funnily enough, I found the name of the book. It was called The Black Art of Vampirism, uh, by a group calling themselves Temple of the Black Vampire. It's not a very good book for several reasons. I'm going to assume everything. And the other one is a work called The Goetia Daemonium by a man with the brilliant name of Frater Maleficus the 13th. I'm going to hope that that's some kind of really bizarre live action role play, just because that second book I mentioned has advice for a magical rite that would involve killing 72 people. Let's all hope that he has not killed 72 people. That would suck. Or sorry, that would be very awful. Like, as it's not a good book. You're welcome to read it if you want. Don't do any of what's in it. I'm actually surprised it's still on Amazon, given that somebody has mentioned it. Like, that's an illegal book. There's no free speech issue with encouraging rape and murder. I'm surprised it was published in the first place, but that aside, so we can move into vampirism.
Yeah, if there's nothing on Dogman left to say except those videos that we can see from either campers or park rangers. Yeah, we say who or what are the vampires? Can we identify anything from the lore, legends, or the Bible that we can somehow explain this thirst for human blood? Could there be something demonic behind this creature?
So a vampire is basically it's a Slavic word for a type of undead revenant that returns from the grave to savage human beings. Sometimes it drinks blood, sometimes it just eats you. Like, yeah, it just goes on, nom nom nom, chomp
That
chomp
sounds
chomp.
better. Yeah.
Yeah, drains your energy, shows up in a number of other ones.
Oh, I
Shows,
know people like that who are into small talk. Yeah, yeah. They completely drain me up, especially at work. And too bad I can't just quit. But yeah, I understand.
actually, one of the big phenomenon in, I won't say big in numbers, but there's been an explosion of literature on psychic vampirism recently, which is the occult equivalent of how to be a toxic individual. Um, that's, yeah, if you ever meet somebody who calls themselves a psychic vampire, just like cut them out of your life for religious and secular reasons combined.
Just block them. That's it.
Yeah, basically vampirism, a type of in the folklore and in the histories going back to, I haven't seen anything in the Bible accepting a very strange argument about Asav that I don't want to get into here because it's very strange. And I'm not sure it was intended to be literal in the original sources, and it's been taken literally by some modern individuals. Is a type of revenant that comes from, or even a revenant itself, comes to savage the living. It's comparable. It is so. It is comparable. Like I guess there's two other types there of sort of vampiric activity. The first is creatures that are just demons. Like they were never human. It's just a demon that comes and it drinks your blood. Lilith, Gallo from Greece, Mormo, Lamia, the Lilith from ancient Sumeria. Like this is a very and this, it's not just a Mediterranean entity. Some people think so. Some people think so. It also goes. It makes its way through India. The other one are certain forms of, I'm just going to like magic black witchcraft, where your body, it's called the like the Filipino Oswang, or Manananggal, shows up in Malaysia, shows up in Thailand, shows up in Japan, shows up in India. The top half of its body splits from the bottom, per the story, and then it drinks human fluids or blood. As I said, very like that would be possibly non-human, possibly witchcraft, like possibly non-human entities hiding as humans, possibly just a form of witchcraft. The vampire it's a reanimated corpse. Pagans interpreted this entity as an unquiet spirit, a view which is, I won't say it's shared by Jews, but it comes close to the Jewish view. Christians swung. There were two Christian views. Half like most of the Christian laity and quite a few Christian theologians have held that it is in fact the restless dead. Some Christian theologians who are on the more skeptical and rationalistic side of things have argued that it's a demon pretending to be a demon seizing control of a human body. Martin Luther went so far as to argue the entire thing was a hallucination, and people who suffered from vampiric encounters were actually just dying because they believed in vampires, which is on the low end of plausible views, but it is there for discussion of historical Christian views. There's like diversity of Christian views, but yeah, basically a type of negative revenant. It has some similarities to the werewolf in that, again, it's the action of a lower animal soul, which is why Daniel Ogden ends up concluding that the vampire, in his book, The Strix Witch, he concludes that the vampire is a continuation of a type of werewolf or witchcraft activity. The truth is, it's just a different way of doing, maybe not a different way of manifesting the same feature of human spiritual physiology.
Did you watch the franchise of movies, The Underworld?
Is that the one with is it Stanikatic? The one with vampires and werewolves? And then
Yeah.
she marries a guy who's half, I love that one, half vampire, half, yeah, that one's a great one.
I don't know if it's exactly that one, but in this, there are several movies in the sequel, in the whole franchise of the Underworld series. Uh, so basically, werewolves and vampires are fighting each other. I just want to ask you, and be honest, whom did you cheer for? Was it vampires or werewolves? Because I was cheering for werewolves. Obviously, I wanted them to demolish those vampires.
Yeah, I was on Werewolf Gang.
Cool.
Werewolves.
We can be friends. We can be friends then. Okay.
Well, werewolves, as we've mentioned, often not malignant to the body, and a case can be made that in some instances they're not malignant to the soul. That's, I know, controversial, but we can just put that. Vampirism always bad. Oh, like the modern, like the glitzy vampire is such a misunderstanding of the absolute terror that vampirism has wreaked on every community that's believed in it. And it's not like just Europeans; it's into India and Africa and Native American societies. Like every single society that's gone, yep, this existed, has been horrified of it. Um, Absolutely evil.
Yeah, I think there's a similarity between vampires and demons. At least one. There are probably more, but the one that crosses my mind is, at least according to the folklore and the tradition, history, whatever. Uh, for both of these, you have somehow to open the door of your house, of your life, so they can enter in. For some reason, uh, they know that you as a living soul is residing in your apartment or house, so somehow they need an open door to come in, to be invited, so they can come and, in any shape and form influence your life, which is usually in a bad way. But this is, for me, a resounding similarity between vampires and demons. They both need your permission in one shape or form to enter your life. And usually, if you allow them, your life gets messed up, even to the point of death. To some people who get demonized. But yeah, I was just thinking about, this similarity. Like, according to the lore of vampires, they will not cross the doorstep and come in your house unless you verbally, orally invite them in. So I was just thinking that's interesting.
There are other similarities. Romanian, Serbian, and a few other Balkan countries assert that vampires are capable of rape. For whatever we want to believe that, there is widespread linkage, and by widespread I mean transcontinental, between vampires and either the abortions or the common practice of exposing your child in a number of pagan civilizations. If you didn't want the baby, you'd leave it out there. This practice continued into, or like after Christianization, unfortunately, in many countries. And it was commonly believed in many of these nations that the children, either the aborted baby or the exposed child, would return as a sort of vampiric spirit. This has led to a lot of exorcistic rites involving children that were aborted or exposed in certain cultures, some all the way into the Buddhists. Oh, sorry, Zach wants to say something, and then I'll talk the Enochic material.
You've played like Witcher 3, right, Nicola? So you remember the baby, that quest line with the weird baby demon?
Oh, it was like a monster baby, right?
Yeah, that's the same folklore he's talking about, right? Where it's the baby that's killed violently and then becomes like an evil spirit, and they had to like purify it.
Yeah, it makes sense because Witcher is coming from Poland, and Poland is Eastern Europe. And I just want to say, in this regard, Jordan, I will plan eventually to bring more about Slavic origins of the vampire folklore, especially me being Serbian. But I want to say, in Serbian novels, because I love fictional novels, there's a lot when it comes to vampires. Once when they become vampires and come back, and they come in the house of their former house. I know it's a novel. No one said really happened, but if it's a novel, it means it must be in the folklore of my people or other Slavic people. The vampire males will come back and continue having sexual um, relationship with their former wives. They wouldn't kill them, but they would continue sleeping with them, even though their bodies would be cold. They would look different, but like, oh, that's still this person, because this person still, even though it's undead, it still knows their family members. And while it may attack some, it may also be harmless towards his former family members. So it's just a messed up. The whole thing is messed up. I'm not saying my people or my folklore. I'm saying the whole story about vampires. For me, it's a corrupted and perverted version of the resurrection, of the coming resurrection, especially of Jesus, which Christians believe. Of course, you don't have to believe because you're a Jew, but for me, this makes sense. This is like a demonic perversion of the true resurrection.
Actually, Jews do believe in the resurrection. It's one of the articles of faith.
No, yeah, but I mean in the
Yeah,
resurrection when it comes to Jesus,
it's funny you mention that, because the biggest connection between vampires and demons is not in works of demonology, but actually is in the Enochic material. So when we always talk about Enoch, most people just think of like the books of Enoch in terms of like, let's just read this and then like derive theology. That's nice. That's great. I want to stop anyone from doing that. But the Enochic works had immense ramifications practically in late antiquity, and most especially on a notion of demonic resurrection, or like, are you familiar with theosis? Yes, it's like anti-theosis or demonic theosis. So the Nephilim. If anyone, I guess the shorthand here is the Nephilim. We, like, looking back, we just sort of tend to equate the Nephilim with demons and then like extend them to any pagan figure indiscriminately. That's not really what they did in late antiquity. In late antiquity, and this is, the Nephilim were most directly correlated with heroes. And this is following the Bible, just for the record. In the book of Numbers, the Nephilim are connected to a Canaanite version of the hero cult. So for those of you who aren't aware, in the ancient pagan world on both sides of the Mediterranean, certain mortals ended up as the center of cultic activity. They were considered to be demigods. This is the origin of the English word hero. Don't worry about using it nowadays, but when we talk about hero, when you see hero in ancient Greek, it's not referring to like a brave or great man. It's referring to somebody who turned into a god, or half a god. Sorry, he turned into a specific type of entity. But there was profound moral ambiguity around this figure. Like, or it was just originally it was just entities picked by like Zeus. Zeus was like, "Oh, you're good. You're a hero." And like Homer, like the individuals in Homer are bloodthirsty. Like the Iliad is a record of cruel, vicious individuals. And this is made so obvious that a number of people have concluded the Iliad was satire. Or like the Greeks grouped it as a tragedy. We, like, people nowadays sort of, you encounter political and religious movements that look up to the Iliad. That was controversial in ancient Greece. Some did, some people did, but quite a few were like, oh no, bro. And this leads to a splintering of heroic traditions in ancient Greece between the I'm so great Homeric hero and the Platonic or Orphic hero. This splinter is also, it's in the Bible where we see the encounter between the Goliath, who is the arch Nephilim, and David, who represents the new biblical hero. And the goal here isn't to condemn heroism in like the modern notion, but rather to elevate a different sort of heroism up to the stage. Similar to, like, this is the cult of the saints appears very early in Christianity, like very early. It appears before the Trinity, and other things of that sort, like hundreds of years before Orthodox Christology, and it's related to this sort of reevaluation. What's most important for our discussion is that by late antiquity, heroes of the Homeric sort were connected not just in the eyes of Jews and Christians to the Nephilim, but in the eyes of Sumerians, what few remained, and Greeks and Romans. And so you end up with these two traditions of like the pious man or the hero who has attained theosis and will attain resurrection, and this demonic anti-theosis, which is connected to themes of unholy rebirth. So the Manichaeans, for example, referred in the Manichaean Book of Giants, which it's basically a word-for-word copy of the Jewish Book of Giants, which is also in Qumran, so way before Jesus. They're described as abortions. The Nephilim are not like it's basically a demonic abortion. In like something happens, they're not brought to term properly, and these things bubble to the surface. I know we're way off from what we might think of as normal vampire lore here, but the sort of connection to Orthodox vampire lore is a number of late, like Greek pagan. It wasn't just Jews and Christians who didn't like the Homeric heroes. They were described in a number of Greek and Manichaean and Neoplatonic sources as vampires. They were these entities who hadn't passed on, and they hadn't attained to the pagan goal of theosis is daemonhood, which should be distinguished from what we might call demonification or demonhood, because it was in fact connected to living a holy life. Whatever you might happen to think about that, but it's just like Clement of Alexandria says that what they call turning into a demon, we call turning into an angel. But for the more on point here is a lot of them did not like hero cults because the heroes were basically some sort of weird vampire, which would in fact, like in some cases, kill people. Achilles killed someone as late as the 2nd century AD. His spirit ripped a woman to shreds, according to Philostratus, who was hardly a Christian. He wrote the life of Polonius of Tyana. And we see this nexus of like demonic themes of rebirth, or demonic rebirth, or demonic fake birth or mixed birth with unholy resurrection and vampiric activity refracted through the ancient world. The sort of interest earlier, I mentioned the Orphic material. Orphic material has been archaeologically demonstrated to have entered Second Temple Judaism before Jesus. By about 200 years, it entered Hellenic Judaism most extensively in the writings of Artapanus and Aristobulus. These fragments have survived to us because we don't have the complete writings of Artapanus and Aristobulus through early church figures, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, who did in fact, they took the Orphica and they took ideas like it and they were like, yeah, this is true. Nothing evil about this, and they sort of built up like some more orthodox notions of theosis were deeply embedded in this. Pagan is maybe the wrong word because the Orphics held to a sort of monotheism. I'm going to depend on how you want to define monotheism, but
okay. And for the last segment of the episode, I know that you wanted to talk about something which was important to you and which gives better context of the tonight's episode, and this will be hermeneutical problems with approaching supernatural encounters. Can we maybe start with you just in one sentence or two explaining what is hermeneutics, and then from there you can talk about this issue and how is it related with tonight's topic of cryptids.
Yeah, how much more time do we have here? Because I know you said you wanted 2 hours, and we're at 2 hours.
Yeah, don't worry. I can stay longer, no problems. I want to respect you. I go to bed way later than you, Jordan. So take as much time as you would like. I want to respect your time.
No, it's more that we're about to talk about the most controversial aspect of the night, because hermeneutics is the science of interpretation. It's most well known to people textually, right? How do we interpret texts? There's the basic level. Abraham walked around. Conclusion: Abraham walked around. And then we're going to be like homiletics. It's like, but this walking was a departure from sin to so and so, and then higher until we get to mystical, and then like at that point we're like, and this embodies the spiritual virtue of blah blah blah, so on and so forth. No need to get too in the weeds. We can extend hermeneutics to our interpretation of supernatural encounters. This would be very in line, like the ancient Sumerians interpreted all of existence as a form of writing. There is absolutely no reason to think that view contradicts the Bible. Like that shows up in the early church and in Judaism. Like existence is one great book. Everything is a form of writing, and thus we can sort of think about everything we do in life as involving a hermeneutics. There's the texts, which is the encounters, and then there's us. The Egyptians had this view too. It was just, if anyone here is into ancient Near Eastern scholarship and the background of the Bible, the textuality of existence was just very important to most ancient religions. Where this gets into the where this really tends to get into the supernatural is, so some entity is, how do we interpret these encounters, right? Because some of these are clearly evil, and it's just a matter of saying how they're evil. I don't think vampirism is demonic in the sense that it's not a demon doing it, but I'm not going to dissent from the view that it's like a horrible activity. Anyone who knows how to make a vampire, we're not going to get into that specific practice. But vampires, not fun. Everything related to vampires, not fun. That's true if we think they're demons or just some other form of horrible evil. Other aspects are, it's more controversial, like Bigfoot. So, and this isn't weird spacecraft Bigfoot, but I'm going to sit in the woods innocuously Bigfoot, not an angel, like clearly not an angel, probably not a physical animal, but also it is very difficult to state that he's demonic without causing some sort of spin-off where by extension everything that's equally innocuous can be accused of demonism on as little evidence, right? Because if we're looking at our evidentiary basis and we're looking at intellectual virtue, so most people here will have heard of intellectual charity or intellectual humility. Intellectual integrity is also a virtue, right? If you have a form of standard that you imply wildly and consistently, that's a horrible sin intellectually. And I would say in general, like if we think the mind is holier than our appetite of faculties, then we should be very paranoid about whether or not we have we have intellectual virtues. So yeah, intellectual integrity, intellectual honesty, which involves not just being true to yourself, but being true to how we see the world. It is not clear how we could conclude that Bigfoot's a demon in the sense of being a malignant spirit, not without creating some horrible catchfall that leads us into, well, maybe everything's a demon. It's the same, less so with werewolfism, but there's a similar problem there where we have people who are doing this. There's no sin to their bodies. And it's difficult to say if there's a sin to their soul. Like the Bible doesn't say don't be a werewolf. No council has ever banned it. It's perfectly it's perfectly legal as far as the major texts are concerned, in the sense that if it is illegal, we need to provide good reasoning beyond, I don't know, dude, it's something weird, I don't like it. And this, this bears on, it doesn't just like bear on our study of Bigfoot and the werewolf, this bears on everything we do in a supernatural worldview. The reason I'm so paranoid about this topic is not because I just love werewolves all that much. It's not the case at all, but rather because it is far, far, far too easy for people to pioneer the, well, maybe this is just a demon, or maybe this just didn't happen in a euhemeristic sense. Like they're just being deluded by psychotropics, even though they didn't take any, into supernatural encounters that as monotheists, we really don't want to be labeled demonism. God, Jesus, angels, if any of you are Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, the saints, the Virgin Mary, so on and so on and so forth. Like we don't want that's where the sort of problem is. It's not with is sort of this intellectual consistency, and it's not a pure intellectual problem either. I mentioned sorry about that. So Paul in the Gospels warns individuals to be wary of spirits. So Paul in the Gospels. Sorry, in one of his epistles, you can see I'm a fervent New Testament scholar. Paul in the Gospels. No, in one of his epistles, Paul mentions that the Satan can hide himself as Jesus, right? There is good reason to think that's true. I've read undeniably demonic encounters where the entity was claiming to be Jesus. But there needs to be some sort of rubric here beyond arbitrarily labeling things as demon or not. And the reason I'm saying that is the Gnostics held that all Orthodox Christian encounters with Jesus were demonic. And they went around telling people, don't trust the Orthodox Christians, they're being misled by demons. And I've read in the I've read people say, like, we have surviving writings where like, well, I was considering baptism, but then I heard it was all just demons. And the Chaldean Oracle, so the Chaldean Oracles are a pagan polemic, or it's a pagan work of the 2nd century. It was purportedly authored by Plato descending in the form of an angel. A fascinating claim that. At one point it mentions that everyone who denies the validity of pagan rites is being misled by demons. This shows up in multiple Neoplatonic arguments against Christianity, and it remains a feature of some neo-pagan arguments today amongst the more spiritually inclined. Now, obviously, demons are real. In like the sense of malignant spirits, you cannot spend any time exploring the supernatural realm or meeting people who have and not realize that there are entities out there that are profoundly malefic. They might be limited in their power, they might not, but they're not limited in their ill intent. But we also need to have some sort of robust way of differentiating them. And so that was why I sort of wanted to bring it up, because, vampires, evil. Werewolves, maybe evil. Bigfoot, not so much. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah, this reminds me of when you're playing RPG games and you're about to set your class. It's like you want good, evil, you want chaos, you want chaotic good, chaotic evil. They're like all these subclasses. It just reminds me of how sometimes you can go into all these nuances of picking. It's not always so white and black, good and evil. It's like you have so much in between. Like you can't always just answer with yes or no, or like left and right. Sometimes it's more difficult than just saying this or that.
Yeah, and I'm not the first person to worry over this. Obviously, like I mentioned, the Neoplatonists, they have an immense, very complicated schema for figuring out. The concern here is figuring out what the entity you're dealing with is. And they have a very complex schema. We don't have to get into it. That would take hours. We would be here for weeks. And even then, we wouldn't have summarized it properly. But these concerns were shared by quite a few Christian theologians throughout history. Michael Sellis, for example, wrote a couple treatises dealing with neutral spirits. I've already mentioned medieval theologians and laity who discussed good werewolves. Quite a few philosophers and theologians in the 15th century discussed the same topic. Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola was another one. Della Mirandola's Orthodox credentials are a bit wild, but Ficino was friends with like half the major Catholic clergy in Italy at the time, and there's no reason to doubt, say, his orthodoxy. Robert Kirk in the 1600s wrote a very famous work defending belief in fairies as a neutral category of spirits. There were a whole bunch, like if you look into the scholarly literature, you'll find a whole bunch of other people who have defended a variety of methods. Like our concern here isn't just creating a schema that allows for Bigfoot to exist as a new, and presumably other entities, not just Bigfoot, to exist as neutral, non-angelic but non-satanic intermediary entities. Our concern is also creating a robust method that will let us deal with like Bigfoot and Bigfoot encounters and encounters like that, and encounters where we've mentioned Bigfoot in a flying saucer a few times. If you read a lot of abduction accounts, and let's just be clear here that I'm ignoring all accounts elicited under hypnosis. So we are only dealing here with people who are in their right mind, are not on drugs, and were able to recall these things without scientifically dubious methods of memory recall. Like the aliens show up and like they have all these random appearances, like Bigfoot, Men in Black, gray aliens, like Jesus. He shows up so often in UFO encounters. A lot of like UFO religions were started by Jesus, quote unquote, like showing up as some blonde-eyed Nordic, and then he's like, and also we should have sex. Like, as I said, not angelic, not divine, but we also need some sort of method. And we don't really have the time to go into that because that would be a whole segment all in itself. But I guess the sort of closing thought here is just when we deal with the supernatural, we shouldn't be waffly poffly new agers who just accept everything that comes to us as if it were as true as the entity claiming it is, because there's multiple ways to prove that the entities are in many cases lying. But we also need to remember here that we're not just engaged in some useful method of conversionary or evangelizing activity. We're engaged in serious ruminations on the nature of the creation God made. And whatever conclusions we reach have profound intellectual ramifications on the lives we live and on the lives we encourage other people to live. And so I guess the sort of final thought here is to just be very cautious when labeling entities. Think hard. And like I could give some advice. We really don't have the time because we wanted to do this over 2 hours and we're now at 2 hours 15. But I could go on for hours, but there are methods, some Christian, some non-Christian, but not wildly nonsensical, for differentiating spiritual entities, which includes a role for malignant entities, but which is, say, a little wary. And then, as I said, we want to be wary. As monotheists, we want to be wary about concluding that all these entities are demons. We also don't want to conclude they're all angels. I'm not taking life advice from Bigfoot. I'm sorry. I don't think he's a demon. I'm not taking life advice from him.
Jordan, I have a last question for you tonight, if it's okay. When you talk about these neutral spirits, they're not demons, they're not angels, they're not necessarily animals, but they do exist, and you give as example Bigfoot. And I know this will be a very difficult and a very unfair or ungrateful question to you, but when it comes to these neutral beings that people obviously see here and there, there's so many eyewitness reports, and like you said, many of them don't use drugs, many of them don't get drunk, many of them get they're either park rangers or religious people. So we have decent reasons why we should believe them in general, not just about some crazy eyewitness reports. But when it comes to these neutral spirits or neutral creatures, how do they fit in the book of Genesis and in general in what we call Old Testament or the Jewish Bible or Tanakh? How does it, where do these creatures belong? I'm not asking like what day did God create them. Okay, they came before people, right? But if we're not talking about those people that came through magical rituals or rites or the occultic or shamanic, you know, manifestations and whatnot. If we talk about just these neutral beings, where do they fit in the Bible? If they're not demons, they're not angels, they're not people, they're not animals, where do these cryptids belong to?
Yeah, this is the fun question, mostly because Judaism has the oral Torah, and the oral Torah includes a lot on this exact topic, and I can't bring up any of it because as Christians, you don't care. The most explicit such reference is in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 22, where God sends a lying spirit. That is clearly not an angel. It's not a demon, but it's clearly like it's a sub-angelic entity, and it's loyal to God. There are a number of other instances where Jews and Jewish tradition affirm that the Bible is referencing semi like non-divine entities. There's one psalm where David lists a number of things that God protects us from, and Jewish tradition affirms that those things are spirits. You're welcome to take whatever view you want on that. I'm not going to foist Jewish views on Christians. Yeah, I'm trying to. Have you studied the Divine Council? I know you've had video. So if I talk about the Divine Council, you guys know that the Canaanite spirits of plague are referred to as loyal servants of God in Habakkuk 3:5. They're not demons. They're not like, I mean, maybe they're like, I'm obviously plague is not fine, but like God sends the plague. Like in the spirits of the plague ride behind him. This shows up in a number of cases. There are, as I said, like the Bible is not really interested in giving us firmly set taxonomies. It clearly has them. Like there are absolutely hierarchy. We can go into the visions of Ezekiel if we sort of want here. There's a clearly set hierarchy of angels in Ezekiel. In elsewhere, the Bible refers to this, but it's a little vague because its purpose is not to talk about matters of demonology, but to talk about matters of the soul. And, you know, there are sort of other quotes in God's plan. I guess we can actually, well, I guess there is one other good sort of example here. So, you know, Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel spends 24 chapters ranting about how awful the Israelites are, right? And then he spends like 9 chapters ranting about this country will be destroyed and that country will be destroyed. And actually, it's sort of prepared some material on Tyre because there's some really interesting stuff there about theosis and anti-theosis and Nephilim, but we'll put that aside. That's Genesis, Ezekiel 28. But the most important one, I guess, to our relevance is Ezekiel 36. So after he spends 33 chapters talking about how everyone sucks, Ezekiel turns his mind to messianic prophecies, right? And so 33 through 39 or 40 are the Messiah, and then I think it's 40 through 48 is about the third temple. And he gives just super meticulous instructions for hundreds of verses about how we're going to build the third temple. But in 33 through 39, he talks about the Messiah. And he talks about, the Jews will come back, they'll fight Gog and Magog, it'll be a big blast. But in 36, he talks about the mountains. Okay, so have you ever talked about Hittite religion on this channel?
I don't think we did. And even if we did, this was months ago. If one of my guests were mentioning, one of the, ancient mythologies, and it wouldn't be discussed in such a great detail. So I'm not sure, but even if we did, we didn't cover that much.
Okay, so there's a lovely little book that people can check out. I believe it's only about 40 Canadian dollars, called Sacred Landscapes of the Hittites and Luvians. And it discusses Hittite theology as manifested in architecture. And we don't have to go into it. The only thing we need to bring up here is central to Hittite folk religion, so the religion of the common Hittite man, which is distinct. In ancient Near Eastern religions, there's a whole theology for the king. Obviously, that was totally irrelevant to most other people, because they're not the king. But in Hittite folk religion, one of the centers of religion was mountain worship. They fervently believed in mountain gods, or entities they called the mountain gods, which are a vague sort of Chthonian, semi-heroic, semi-gnomish / dwarf class of spiritual entity. We don't have to get into the particulars here, other than to clarify that it is clearly not some angel. Now, Ezekiel earlier on excoriates the Jews for following Hittite practices and implies that they had trusted in the mountains, right? So he doesn't state that they were doing mountain worship, at least not in any translation or commentary I've ever read. But it's a reasonable enough hypothesis that if the Israelites were doing half the idolatry Ezekiel accuses them of doing, they were worshiping the mountain gods, right? So, following the sort of assumption of a duality where there's only angels and, say, demons, the conclusion should be that when God discusses bringing the Jews back to Israel, he talks about the Jews coming in, and then he'll lump the mountain spirits in with Gog and Magog, the forces of darkness to be destroyed in the end times. Yet he does not do that. God instead asserts that the Jews will reclaim the mountains and he'll restore them to their glory. I could read it, but it's like 20 verses of poetry about how amazing the mountains will be, and the Jews will claim ownership over them, or Israelites from the Christian perspective. So he does not promise destruction of the mountains. He doesn't promise destruction of the mountain spirits. Instead, he promises that the mountains will be incorporated into the kingdom of God. This connects to the earlier motif in Genesis, in which, all of the Bible is basically a commentary on Genesis 1-3. That's going to make a lot of people upset, but I'm sorry. That's the whole Bible, is just a commentary on Genesis 1-3. And Genesis 1-3 is God creates paradise. He creates a garden, right? And then he makes man, and he puts man in this garden, and man binds heaven, and he binds earth, right? He's made in the divine image, but he's in a physical body. And this is important if we want to talk about theosis and resurrection, right? When we talk about resurrection, we're not just talking about whizzing off as spirits, which is what we might bring up if we were Gnostic. When we talk about resurrection, we talk about these coming back, right? Which means it's not just the spiritual component of man, the imago Dei, that's important, it's not just his sort of inner self that's important. The rest of your body is just as important when living a pious life. But then man sins. He breaks God's decree. Eden is gone. Man's kicked out of the garden, and he's set alone in the wide world. This means that when we're talking about the return to the Edenic state, we're not talking about blowing up every shrubbery in our path. We're talking about the restoration of the original divine paradise, which the world was intended to be before it fell into its current state. And so if you want to talk about neutral spirits, the best answer I can give you based off the Bible, and I can elaborate this based off Jewish material, but I think I can make not the most amazing, but a reasonably good case for it, is that our duty with these entities is the same as our duty with everything else in the world, which is to make of it a garden. Right? If anyone here has read Tolkien, you guys know what I'm talking about. Be Samwise Gamgee.
Jordan, thank you so much for man, it's been a blast. All these the whole episode has been a wealth of information and knowledge you dumped on us. So it's like it was so enjoyable for all the nerds out there. When I listen to you, I imagine this character either in a video game or in a novel who is between an archaeologist and a private detective or investigator and like a theologian. It will be a character that embodies all these qualities, personalities, all these abilities, and it's like you just want to either play with this character in a game, if it's a detective or adventure or logical game, or you want to read this novel, how this person is going to some mysterious adventures and finding out some skeletons, going to some deep caves, retrieving some artifacts. It's like it was so fun, at least for me. So for the very ending, do you have in a minute or two, do you have any concluding thoughts, any final message that you would say to our viewers regarding this topic of cryptids?
No, I believe I summed it up, right? Like our be when exploring this topic, be sensitive, be consistent, right? Remember, Paul's advice in Ephesians 6:4. He has made of you an armor and a shield of God. And I mean, if for Christians, you've been baptized into that, and that's an obligation upon you. Jews have the Torah, which has similar obligations to be charitable to all and loving to all, and and judge righteously. And remember, God put you on this earth to make a garden, and if you're going to conduct spiritual warfare, conduct it like Samwise Gamgee would. I guess that's my concluding thought.
That's amazing. Thank you, Zach. I know that you didn't talk too much tonight,
Yeah,
but
I'm
you
enjoying
will.
it too.
You will soon. Don't worry. Don't worry. We didn't forget about you. What will be your concluding thoughts for tonight? What is something that you've been wanting to share with the audience, but maybe you didn't want to interfere our conversation?
Nah, I'm good. I just want to tell you, Bigfoot loves you, and we do too.
That's amazing. Well, my concluding thought would be so I know the episodes with this name, with this title, could raise a lot of eyebrows in the among the religious people who are either scholarly, theologically inclined, or who are too mature to think about these topics. They may think this is childish. On the other hand, we have people who are into conspiracies and they're so naive that they will believe any book, any eyewitness report, any article, any information they Google. I don't want to belong to either of these. When I started the channel 7 months ago, I wanted it to be a combo of biblical theology, yes, supernatural, but focusing as much as we can on theological um, and academic religious sources so that someone before us and preferably multiple of scholars and historians or archaeologists before us did a thorough job by investigating something so that we can quote them and we can say, hey, this person with this PhD title has written this or said this. So there's some weight when you mention a book or a scholar or theologian by that name on the channel or in your research papers and in general. So my concluding thought would be for people who are listening to this and if they're especially in the category of religious person of any church, any synagogue, any temple, don't be so skeptical to acknowledge that there are many supernatural and paranormal things and beings in the unseen realm. Also, don't be naive to just believe anything. My mind is skeptical. When I came to faith, little bit over 20 years ago, I thought I had to dump um, everything supernatural, everything sci-fi and fantasy that I loved, and that sucked in a way because that's who I am. I love these things. I love these comic books, novels, movies, TV shows, games. Why ditching all of that? And then I started reading Dr. Michael Heiser's work and get acquainted with other theologians, people online, including Zechariah, and now with you, Jordan. And that brought such an enthusiasm and passion and understanding. Hey, these things, um, there should be no false dichotomy. You don't have to choose paranormal, supernatural, fantasy on one side and then the Bible on the other side. No, you can have both. And there's a way, there's a paradigm, there's a pattern, there's this symbolical, well, it's not just symbolical, there's this reality how the two can correlate and exist, and it gives so much of the it explains so much of this needed cultural, historical, and supernatural background of what we call the Bible. um, so I would encourage all the viewers not to be too skeptical, mind you, even though I am skeptical, but also not to be naive and believe everything. This channel was brought to you so we can talk about topics that are not mentioned so much in Christian academia or in churches. I don't know about other monotheistic religions like Judaism and Islam or their scholars, but at least in churches and Christian academia, these topics are not mentioned very often because they can be too vague. They can be taken as silly, childish stories. They can be but they can be just put under the rug, like just with the topic of divine counsel. Like, are you talking about other gods? Are you talking about this? Are you talking about, there are other beings in, besides angels in the heavenly realm? Or there this, no, that's too much. First Enoch is garbage just because it's not part of the canon. So we can have all these arguments, and I think all of us have met people like this. So while on the one hand, I don't want people to be too naive and just believe in everything they're reading or listening. I also don't want people to be too much guarded. Like late Dr. Michael Heiser said, I don't want you to be protected from the Bible. I want you to be open and believe what it says. But because the Bible is not that thick of a book and has a limited number of pages and books that come um, in the canon, there's so much of the reality and stuff that God didn't reveal to us, but they do exist. Mathematics is not necessarily revealed, but even if it comes from the pagan mathematician or atheist mathematician who may say, "Hey, let me show you how 5 and 5 is 10," we don't have to be guarded against these things. So I would just encourage people to be open-minded and research things. And I would promise to you that if you start including this supernatural background to your biblical studies and your relationship and walk with God, it will enhance so much. You would understand and see things that you did not do before, and you will do yourself a service. And if you're leading a Bible study, or even as a man or a woman in the house, you're having these Bible studies with your kids, they will be grateful to you one day. So this topic is not an easy one. This topic was not brought to you so you can bring gazillion of clicks when people see cryptids, werewolves, giants. Ooh, I want to see this because I like supernatural. No, it was brought so that people who are believers, but they do acknowledge there's something beyond that, but I don't know how to reconcile the two. So just encourage people to be curious and to start buying more books and follow interesting YouTube podcasts and channels, not just this one, including Zechariah, Jordan. I know that you and Zechariah are writing fictional religious novels. So one day when you guys publish your novels, I will interview you guys. I want to promote your material. I want people to get to acquainted more to just everyday topics like, oh, this is politics, or this is career, or this is sport. I want people to start thinking deeper. I want people to read more extensively because correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, but in the Jewish history and tradition, learning, and I knew the proper words, but I forgot them. I'm sorry. But learning and teaching that in the community, especially when it comes to men, was highly valuable. And having this oral tradition memorized and being able to teach and being a itinerary, if you were one of those itinerary teachers and had followers, you passed the knowledge on them. All of this was always highly esteemed in the Jewish tradition, unless I'm wrong. This is what I was learning a while ago. And I just want to encourage people, primarily Christians, to continue this wonderful tradition. And I'm sorry if my conclusion was too long. I didn't plan to, but I just wanted to give some final thoughts and conclusion and a summary to this very important topic. So don't run away just because you see the title, oh, cryptids, werewolves, vampires, this is garbage. How can this be connected with academia or serious scholarly work? As Jordan has portrayed tonight, it can be. There's a lot of scholarly materials which is dealing with this, not based on just eyewitness reports, but of people who are smart enough and have good enough tools and know how to use them to dissect this material. But Jordan and Zechariah, thank you so much for having time for myself and for the audience. I'm looking forward to one day when we will hang out again and talk more about this very interesting theological and nerdy topics. I'm very grateful, and I wish both of you God's blessing and Godspeed in your work, ministries, schools, writing the novels and everything. And may you have a wonderful and fruitful week. Thank you and God bless.